You are listening to the Toxic Mold Podcast with Steve Worsley, the toxic mold expert and your number one source for mold consulting and mitigation in the USA. Let's dive into a brand new episode. Before we get started on this episode, here's a not so short disclaimer. While all attempts have been made to verify the content provided in this podcast, neither the podcaster or the producers assume any responsibility for errors, omissions, or alternative interpretations of the issues discussed here. All information stated in this podcast is the opinion of Steve Worsley. Steve Worsley is a mold specialist with over 25 years of experience in the construction and mold industry. The Toxic Mold Podcast is for information sharing purposes only. The views expressed are those of the podcaster and his alone. These views should not be taken as expert instruction or commands. While there may be references to medical conditions and symptoms, all podcast episodes are the opinion of Steve Worsley, and any medical questions or concerns shall be addressed with the appropriate licensed medical professional or professionals. As the podcaster refers to different mold types, please be aware that Steve Worsley is not a microbiologist, and questions concerning mold specifics should be answered by the appropriate professional. Steve isn't, nor does he offer any legal advice. For any legal advice, you must speak with a lawyer. The listener is 100% responsible for his or her own actions. You can check out Steve's books on Amazon. Just go to Amazon and search for author Steve Worsley. You can also take Steve's courses on Udemy or Skillshare, and you can find out more about those at cnccontractorservices.com. Now, let's get to the episode.
Hello, you're listening to the Toxic Mold Podcast with myself, Steve Worsley, and we have my wife, Cassandra. It's the middle of December, so Christmas is around the corner.
I know. So fast. The year just blew by.
Yeah, before we know it, we're going to be doing our 2025 goals.
Yeah, that's true.
Anyhow, today is a kind of a touchy subject, depending on what's going on, but the title is, What is PRV testing after toxic mold removal? Do you know what PRV means?
Yes.
What is it?
Post-remediation verification. I have a cheat sheet, though, so that helps.
Well, you've heard me use the term probably quite often, so I would expect that you are familiar with it.
Yes, but I look at PRV as after the remediation is done, did everything get cleared up in the way you expect? That's what
Exactly.
it is. After mold mitigation testing.
Yep. And PRV also includes a visual inspection, too, of the remediated areas.
So it's not just testing.
Correct.
So if somebody got mold remediation and the mold remediation company or a third party said we did PRV, but there was no inspection, then that was an incomplete PRV, correct?
By my definition and opinion, of course.
Okay.
Just like we talk about all the time, a inspection is just as important, in my opinion, as testing.
Well, and I think it's important to know that there is such a thing as something being done and something being done right. And I guess for those that are listening, help explain why, in your expert opinion, just testing as PRV is not enough.
You could be very selective, or whoever does the PRV testing could be very selective as to where they perform the testing.
Oh, so you can actually mess with the results if all you're doing is testing of certain areas.
Exactly.
Okay.
So part of, just so our listeners understand, part of PRV testing is air testing and surface sampling. And so for our listeners, and they're like, well, I've heard that air testing's not always accurate. That's true. That's why we do inspections with them. Surface testing is, so let's say we remove the sheetrock on the wall. There's insulation behind that. The insulation, if it's wet, should be removed. Then there could be, and that's a big could, there could be mold growth on the studs behind that wall covering. Part of proper mold remediation is abrasive removal, so sanding, dry ice blasting, baking soda blasting, wire brushing. After you're done with the treatments, which is the abrasive removal, we use chemicals, there's different processes we follow. We want to do surface sampling on that stud or whatever, sill plate, OSB, subfloor, to to make sure that we sanded deep enough to remove the mold hyphae.
Okay, so then that sounds like it's a multifaceted approach to making sure that things got resolved.
Exactly. So going back to your question, let's say our listeners, they hire, one of our competitors, one of those restoration companies. They come in, they do the mold remediation. Even if they hire a third-party company, that company comes in for the PRV side of things. Going back to the example I just used, what if they didn't sand all the mold away? They could be very selective as to where they do the surface sampling.
Oh, okay. And so they could do the surface sampling in an area where they did sand.
Yeah, so let's just say, going back to my scenario I gave you, we remove the wall covering, the studs behind it have some discoloration. We don't know for sure if it's mold. In my opinion, it's a waste of time and money. To test for it, we abrasively remove that mold. Mm-hmm. But we could just go in and sand one stud in one little section. Then for the PRV, they take the sample from that specific location just to make sure it passes.
Exactly, but not, okay, so really when PRV testing is done well, it is more comprehensive in nature.
Exactly.
You're not fudging the numbers by only inspecting areas you took care of.
Exactly. And it kind of, to backtrack a little bit for our listeners, like who does the PRV testing? I always recommend a third party for the reasons we just talked about.
Yes,
But it is common for us to do it because we do it for a cheaper price, not just because we're trying to make it pass. We take so many pictures that we could show to our clients, like we removed that mold. But at the end of the day, like if you hire or pay us to do it, we're going to do it for a lower price just because we're already there. We're taking care of it.
But don't you think it also has to do with, I know that there are lots of people in mold groups who say it's a conflict of interest to have the company that did the mold remediation do even initial mold testing protocols and then PRV testing. But isn't there something to having continuity of care throughout the entire process? Every company does it a little bit different under different circumstances and using different methods or approaches. I think you would contaminate the PRV results by having somebody not consistently through the whole process, no?
No, I completely agree. We've talked, our listeners, if they listen every week, we've talked about the whole, should CNC Contractor Services do the initial inspection? Should they do the remediation? Should they do the PRV? Our listeners should understand how I feel, how you feel about it. If you don't trust the company, you shouldn't be using them for anything. Now, on the other hand, depending on the situation, it might be advantageous to hire a third-party company. But going back to what you're talking about, if I don't do the remediation, I didn't do or was not involved in what I call the cool down period, I have no idea what happened right before I did the PRV inspections and testing. Once again, that's why the inspection part is so important. But I have had this happen, and you've heard me talk about it. I'll come in, do PRV testing. I can smell ozone. I can smell chemicals. I can tell that they literally were fogging and running ozone machines right up until they saw me pull into the driveway. Mm-hmm. That's going to skew the results.
Absolutely. And so I think if somebody's listening to this, and maybe this is the first time they've come across the Toxic Mold podcast, you do have at least 1 or 2 episodes that go over all the types of mold testing, don't you?
Oh, of course. Yeah.
Yeah. So you'll just want to look back. If you're listening to this and you're like PRV, swab, air test, and you're like, I am lost in the sea of these definitions, we do have a number of episodes that go in detail into what all the mold testing looks like.
Exactly. And it brings up a good point. So for our listeners, what should you be doing for PRV testing? I always recommend air testing. We always do a baseline outside. We'll do a few inside the containment. Once again, depending on how many containments, the type of work, the style of the building, you should do it inside the containment with the containment plastic still up. Mm-hmm. That way, we can hopefully, prevent any cross-contamination concerns, and then you should do one outside of the containment. So for our listeners, let's say they had mold remediation done in their basement. You should do, and let's say it's just a basement, bedroom, and bathroom. You should do an outside test, a test in the bathroom, and a test inside, let's just say, a laundry room. Then you should do a test upstairs that's outside of the containment.
Okay, just to have some comparison.
Exactly.
Between inside and outside of the containment, and then outside of the home.
Exactly. And the outside of the home is just our baseline. But to kind of finish up my point is air testing, surface sampling is what you should do. Should you do an ERMI test or an EMA test for PRV? Not right after the cool down period. Meaning, for our listeners that don't understand, an ERMI and an EMA is dust sampling. If you think about, from my perspective as a professional, we're inside of a containment. Everything's cleaned. We've HEPA vacuumed everything, damp wiped. We've done all of the SPC, which is small particle cleaning. There shouldn't be enough dust to do an ERMI or an EMA. So for our listeners, the ERMI and the EMA are way more expensive than air testing. I wouldn't do it.
Okay, so for those who are new to EMA is the mycotoxin testing. And so should people expect with post-remediation verification testing that testing for mycotoxin is just a part of that, or that's totally separate?
It wouldn't be.
Okay.
Now, can we do that? There's different mycotoxin testing methods and labs. We work with Hayes Microbial and with Real Time Lab. There is a mycotoxin test that we could do, and it could be either EMA, which is through Real Time Lab, or just a mycotoxin test. But once again, those are dust samples. We probably are not going to have enough dust to come to an accurate conclusion.
So really, for anything that's mycotoxin testing related, you'd want to wait a few months after PRV testing to actually properly assess it.
Yeah. And I would say, from my opinion, 4 to 6 weeks.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's good to know.
Yeah, and once again, so it would really determine, the situation for the client or for our listeners, like where would you do that mycotoxin testing? It all depends on what they want to see. There's nothing wrong with doing an EMA test in what was, because at this point, it's not the containment anymore. They've lived in the home normally. There's nothing wrong with only doing those rooms, meaning you only gather the dust from the laundry room and the bathroom.
Mm-hmm. So that makes sense. What do you say to people who ask the question, do I really even need PRV testing? I mean, I've done the mold remediation. I've paid for it. They did their job. I don't have any more money to invest on anything if they find anything anyway. Why should I do PRV?
Just to determine what the air quality is after the remediation. And if one of my clients said, hey, Steve, we can't afford it. So just for our listeners, what does it cost? Depends on how many air samples and how many surface samples we send to the lab. You're talking literally less than $300 or $400. So I would say to my client, we have it built into our remediation costs. You might as well do it.
Okay.
Now, if they say, well, I want you to take that $300 or $400 off the price of the remediation, that's a totally different conversation. But to answer your question more or less directly, if you can't afford it, you just don't do it.
Yeah.
I don't think it's a good idea, but that's just my opinion.
Well, what do you say in terms of what people should expect in terms of results? I've heard a lot of people say things like, well, did we pass?
Yeah.
Well, what do you say to, I think people are looking at the results and expecting to see certain things, but what should they see?
So this is going to sound odd and contradicting, but there's no pass or fail to air testing per se. Now, the reason I say that is we have no standards that are very definitive as to what a passing air test would look like. Now, that's why we do a baseline sample. But as far as failing, there are several things that I would for sure say as a fail. So with air testing, if there's Stachybotrys, Chaetomium, or Fusarium. Those are kind of the three mold types that if I see that, I'm like, hey, we got issues. If you see that, that would for sure be a fail. Now, with a surface sample, there is clearly a pass or a fail. A surface sample, for our listeners, it's literally a tape lift. It's double-sided tape. We take the protective cover off. We put it on that stud that previously had mold or discoloration. We remove that, put it back in its slide, send it to the lab. The lab's going to look at that, and they're going to say, mold is present and tell us the mold types, or not present. We want to see not present for a surface sample.
Okay.
Now, for an air sample, mold's naturally present, so you're going to see mold types in that air sample. Did I answer your question?
You did. So again, people, it's not a pass or fail thing.
It kind of is. I know that sounds, it's a weird...
but it's not there's not a cutoff number. And I guess what I'm trying to get to is I think people expect that any mold tester consulter, mitigator can run these tests, and that what they're going to receive via email in the form of report is a very well explained document. But the key to these PRV results is that it does require interpretation by the expert.
Exactly.
And discussion with the client, correct?
Exactly. And that's why the inspection part of PRV is so important.
Mm-hmm.
Like, let's say I'm doing a PRV for third party. So for our listeners, it's a remediation project that we did not do. Okay. Let's say I go in there initially, I find mold. They hire one of our competitors, a restoration company. Then I get called either by my client or the restoration company. They say, hey, we're ready for PRV testing. If I go in there and I visibly see discoloration or what I think is mold, it's going to fail. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So at that point, I would tell our listeners, like, there's no reason to even test. Does that make sense?
That does make
Unless I have to prove it.
Yeah, but that brings up another question I have. So how comfortable should a mold expert, because I know there are lots of mold experts who also listen to this podcast, but I'm just curious, from your perspective, how comfortable should a mold expert feel on conducting PRV testing on a do-it-yourself mold mitigation job? I mean, just because you don't know the circumstances under which somebody watched a YouTube video and decided rather than hire an expert to do it themselves. Like, how does PRV testing by a professional work when you are only coming in at the end and you know the people did it themselves?
Well, even if I didn't know they did it themselves, I could probably ask a few questions and I would know.
Okay.
I would ask, what type of plastic sheeting did you use for your containments? Did you put any doors in the containment? What type of doors were they? Did you abrasively remove the suspected mold? There are ways that I would know for sure, in my opinion. But to answer your question, as far as professionals, at the end of the day, once again, this is why mold's so complex. There's so many variables, but if you're an IEP who's listening, you get called in to do a third-party test. At the end of the day, you're paid to go in there and do your job, inspect it and test. It's not up to the IEP to determine if it was done to current standards. Does that make sense? Or did I answer your question?
You did, but I'm just wondering, how reliable do the PRV testing results, how reliable are they if you as the expert don't know the truth of what was done? I'm just curious.
Well, I guess the reason that's a difficult answer is because at the end of the day, and our listeners are going to be like, wait, that doesn't make any sense. At the end of the day, I don't think anybody can definitively say these passed and this is acceptable.
Okay.
Does that make sense? I could go inside of a containment and do the PRV inspections and testing. Everything looks great. That doesn't mean if our listener doesn't mean that their home's completely safe. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
We could do PRV, and let's say it's an entire home. So for our listeners that are like, Steve, you're kind of confusing me. Remediation only takes place in usually a couple of rooms. Mm-hmm. Let's say the remediation's done. We did it. It's done perfectly. Even if we did the SPC, which is small particle cleaning, after the remediation, mm-hmm. I can't definitively say to our listener, to my client, everything's good to go. For a few reasons. We didn't remove everything in the home. Mm-hmm. So there could be cross-contamination concerns with their bed, their couch, or whatever. On top of that, let's say we removed everything. Everything looks great. Testing looks good. They could literally rehab it, so put the insulation and sheetrock back in and have a roof leak the next day.
Absolutely.
Which could cause mold.
Absolutely.
So that's why I think what you're getting at is should people trust definitively that the PRV test results are good to go? Is that what you're saying?
No, what I'm really saying is how can you as an expert or anybody as an expert stand behind the PRV results when you don't know if somebody was running ozone machines right till 5 minutes before you showed up on site to do PRV, or if somebody decided rather than sanding the whatever, they decided to just spray everything with kills. Like, how can you stand behind PRV when you don't actually know what was actually done? Okay.
And you brought up something I want our listeners to understand. If I was to go in and do PRV testing, meaning we didn't do the remediation, and I see a bunch of kills or waterproofing applied, to me, that's automatically a red flag. Like,
okay.
What did they cover up? If we did all the remediation and we hired a third-party company, and even if we don't, we do all of our PRV testing prior to waterproofing.
Okay.
So,
okay.
It's a multifaceted question. But at the end of the day, I think to get at what you're saying, and this is hard for our listeners, for me to say it this way, but I don't think you can ever definitively say that any test results mean everything is good to go. Because the conditions can change.
In a heartbeat.
There could be the lab could have misinterpreted what they saw under a microscope. There's just so many variables that it's hard to say. Now, for our listeners that are saying, well, then why do you even do PRV? It's one piece to the mold puzzle.
Absolutely. It's one marker of data that you're going to spend the lifetime of being in that home documenting so that you know when something changes.
Exactly. And for our listeners, if you're having remediation done and you're saying, well, I'm not going to pay the remediation company until Steve looks at the results and says it's good to go, that's really not how it works. Like for us as I'm a certified remediation contractor. Once we fulfill our contractual agreement, meaning our scope of work has been completed, at the end of the day, you've got to pay.
Absolutely.
You can't just try to withhold money because it didn't pass. Does that make sense?
No, that totally makes sense. But it also speaks to another point. There is a responsibility of the expert, but there's also a responsibility of those living in the home. You've got to monitor humidity. You have to look for signs of new moisture intrusion events. You've got to have like the luft. I mean, there's lots of things that the one remediation or even the fifth remediation will never solve the bad habits you won't fix.
Exactly. And I always say it, mold is the gift that keeps on giving. And at the end of the day, PRV has a purpose and its place, but you can't just take that to the bank.
Absolutely. It's a snapshot in time.
Exactly.
So what's your call to action for people?
Well, you brought up the whole DIY thing. Make sure you hire the professionals, whether it's for remediation, inspections, PRV testing. Get somebody that you know has the credentials. A certification doesn't mean that they're qualified, but neither does 30 years experience. So my whole point is to our listeners, make sure you get the proper professionals in there.
And don't you offer a free worksheet on how to hire the right mold professional?
Yep. We have an email opt-in that it's just a one-page PDF document, how to hire the proper professional. I also offer scope of work services. So for our listeners, it's literally a detailed way that remediation should happen. So you can reach out to me if that's a service you would like. It's very beneficial. It's not for our listeners to do the remediation themselves, but it does break down how everything should be done.
Awesome.
Well, I appreciate all you listeners. We couldn't do this without you. Our audience keeps growing and growing, and Christmas is coming up. So thank you and have a great week.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Make sure you go to our website at cnccontractorservices.com and sign up for the mold investigation checklist. Again, go to cnccontractorservices.com and get your free mold investigation checklist today. You can also on cnccontractorservices.com find out more about Steve's courses and books and consultations. Once again, go to cnccontractorservices.com.